Well, good afternoon, everyone. Hey, good afternoon. Welcome to our 18th annual Signum Fidei Lecture. My name is Dr. Kurt Chapman. I'm Vice President for Mission here at Lewis University, and on behalf of all of us here at the University, I'd like to welcome you to this tradition. We've had the Signum Fidei Lecture now for 18 years. We've taken a break every once in a while, and we've had to skip a year for reasons, but for the most part, this is a program that was started back in the early 2000s, and the idea is to bring people to campus that can shed light on our identity as a Catholic university. And so over these past 18 different lectures that the university has sponsored as part of this program, we've had church figures, we've had an Illinois Supreme Court justice, we've had theologians and authors, professors of religious studies and history, we've had university presidents, campus ministers. So Cristal and Juan, no pressure at all in terms of the legacy that you're part of. This is a great opportunity, though, to shed a light on an aspect of our identity as a Catholic university. The name of this lecture is called the Signum Fidei Lecture. Anybody know what Signum Fidei stands for? Sign of faith, Latin for sign of faith. And if you look at the university's seal, which is taken directly from the seal of the De La Salle Christian Brothers, Signum Fidei lies at the center of our identity as a university, both in terms of this symbol and who we are and what we do. And so the idea behind this lecture is to bring to campus individuals who can shed light on our faith as a Catholic institution. And we're delighted to have Juan and Cristal from Fe y Vida here today. Fe y Vida is a nationally recognized, about 30-year-old organization that focuses on the faith formation and development of Hispanic young adults. And so they are affiliated with Lewis University. We're very proud of our relationship and our collaboration with them. And we're really excited about their presentation today. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and sit down and we'll continue with our program.
So let us remember that we are always in the holy presence of God. Loving God, our world is in need of gente puente, bridge people. Bridge people who connect with different perspectives, ideas, and faiths. People who use their hands for creating, not tearing down. Who use their hearts to show compassion, not hatred. Who use their voices to share stories and celebrate the good, not to spread mistruths and focus on the negative. Lord, help us to be these people in our actions, in our thoughts, and in our words each day. We are not perfect people, but with your love, we can be better than we were the day before. Amen. St. John Baptist de La Salle, pray for us. Live Jesus in our hearts. Amen.
Buenas tardes. Good afternoon, Lewis community. How are we doing today? So it is with great pleasure that I stand here today and I introduce to you the 18th annual Signum Fidei Lecture, and as indicated earlier, entitled Gente Puente, Latino Contributions for Building Today's Cultural, Political, and Religious Divides. So in doing so, I'd like to begin by shedding light on our theme for today, that of which is nested in setting the tone for the various ways in which our own community can continue to join together to drive our newest mission. During today's conversation, I invite you to reflect on how we put emphasis on justice. That is, how do we honor the development of critical and vibrant coalitions within our Lewis community? Critical coalitions that must grow out of strategic community attempts. Despite ethnic, racial, religious, and linguistic divides, we must build together to change the material conditions of people's lives. In particular, those that are often put at great risk due to the social and political climate that we currently live in. This means that we must work hand in hand to foster a community based on alliances that become stronger over time and not solely based on our short-term common interests. And with that being said, I am really excited to introduce our guest speakers for today. First and foremost, Crystal Serrano, Puebla. She's a first-generation Mexican-American born and raised in Chicago and is an alumnus of Lewis University. And I need not speak any more introduction of her, as I'm sure she will continue to introduce herself. But in addition to that, I'd also like to welcome Juan Escarfuller. Is that correct? Escarfuller, perdón. Who serves as Director of Leadership Training and Biblical Pastoral Ministry at Instituto Fe y Vida. So please join me in giving them a round of applause.
Doctora Maravilla, thank you so much. Office of Mission and Identity, thank you very much. And all the collaborators behind the scenes who made possible Isabel and myself being able to share with you from our experience, from our work, from our study, from our pastoral ministry, something which we think makes a difference, both here at Lewis and in the world at large. So, Gente Puente, bridge people. How many of you already have heard of Gente Puente? We got a taker. Okay, all right. So, in parentheses there, bridge people. We're going to talk about bridging, especially in a world today that is full of divides, and more than divides, I dare say polarized divides. How many of you have felt either in yourself, in your families, in your communities, or even here on campus, that it's sometimes hard to talk about religion, it's sometimes hard to talk about politics, it's sometimes really hard to talk about culture? Okay. There are a lot more hands. So I think we're on to something in terms of a common challenge, that we live in a world that, I'll speak for myself, startles me. And I know that's by design when it comes to the media. I know that they get my eyes if they can scare me somehow, right? When I saw January 6th, I still actually, like 9/11, I stay away from those images because it triggers something deep inside of me. There are some things that I think we're living as a society that more than just we're polarized across the divide, I think in some ways are traumatizing for a lot of us. And so I'm not surprised that so many hands went up when it came to, am I having trouble even in my own family, even at my own table, talking about some of these things? Cristal and I are very much touched by the image of the encounter here on campus. And by the way, as I have immersed myself into the Lasallian world, thank you, Christian brothers, I've noticed that that image of Jean-Baptiste de La Salle's encounter with a young man when he was on his way to do business as usual regarding something else, and it made all the difference in the world for him. The whole notion of walking through a doorway is really powerful for me as I think about, if I'm going to cross the chasm, what are the doorways that I need to go through? So, Cristal and I have organized our presentation in terms of 3 doorways that we want to walk through. One is to talk about the social context. As we prepared this presentation, we noticed that Signum Fidei has a tradition of looking at social issues that affect the church and its people. Then we're going to talk about theological context, and specifically a certain spirituality that is building on the Catholic tradition, and you probably have heard about it tons. And then lastly, we're going to do a very close look, both before and after, of how teens were, right, by the way, in this very same room, in those very same chairs, were impacted by a certain bridging program here at Lewis called Engaging Stories, and how now they're leading locally as a result of what they experienced in this space, in this program. So having said that, I'd like to There, too fast. Talk about the social issues, especially in terms of how might we get some context or some frames about the polarization, the divides in today's world, and maybe see they're as old as dirt. They've been around, and maybe look at what's happened in the past, especially I'm going to speak from my Latino heritage. What is it that informs me from my social location when I come to you as a dialogue partner in this? Then we'll look at some snapshots of the engaging stories experience. And lastly, Cristal and I proudly work for Instituto Fe y Vida. As Dr. Kurt Schachmuth pointed out, we focus on leadership formation of youth and young adults in the Latino community. Leadership and faith formation. Because we were founded by, guess who? The Christian Brothers. Which has so much to do with why we're here at Lewis. Because there's an affinity there in terms of Jean-Baptiste de La Salle's preferential option for working with young people, and especially the poor, the marginalized, and the excluded. And Latino youth definitely in many ways fall within those categories. Now, we're hoping, though, to expand, and consider that maybe they're having experiences that could serve as parables, metaphors for our own stretching and building bridges across those divides that so many of us identify with as being a challenge in our lives today. So, having said that, I'd like to talk to you about my social location. How many of you have seen this image? Raise your hand if you have. How many of you have seen it in person? And I'm hoping that there are a few folks who are live streaming in who are saying, yes, yes, I've been there. So I'm originally from Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic. And the day in August of 1975 that I was leaving the Dominican Republic as an 8-year-old with my grandmother accompanying me to the U.S., we passed this statue. It's colossal. There, Santo Domingo is a port city. And it is a statue of Antonio de Montesinos. And the famous line is, are they not human? How many of you know that story? One of the things in my work, some of us do, is that especially a lot of Latino youth do not know the story. And to me that is sad, because I think there's a lot to be learned there about what was the thinking, doing, and being back in those days that maybe will shed some light on our world today. So it's December 21st of 1511. I don't think anybody was alive then, but the point is, this was initially at the start of the colonization of the Americas, especially by the Spanish Empire. And specifically, the community of Dominican priests who had gathered in Santo Domingo decided for the first time in the Americas to denounce the enslavement of the indigenous. And guess who they chose in the community to deliver that sermon? The oldest friar? No, they chose the youngest. I wonder why they chose the youngest. But he famously asked the question, are they not human, referring to the indigenous? And actually turned it as a way to indict the colonizers before him in the church to say, you act worse than what you envisioned them to be. Because he says you envision them to be animals, you envision them not to be human. Are they not human? Now, one of the things that I'd like to pull as a frame from this social location in my life is my grandmother just left it at that. But later, as I grew up, one of the things that fascinated me is that there was a debate much later on in the Spanish Empire, especially in light of the genocide that comes from this, whole island populations being wiped out, and the convenient solution among many to say, well, just import slaves from Africa to replace these slaves. I don't know about you, but that's just like, that's a gut punch for me, that they would even think in that direction. But the debate was basically Sepúlveda saying in the Spanish court, it's okay to mistreat and enslave them because they are natural slaves. They don't have cities like we have cities. They don't have laws like we have laws. They don't worship the way we worship. They don't even have clothes and coinage the way we have clothes and economy. Las Casas says, whoa, 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 whoa. As a great, almost anthropologist, ethnographer, he had documented they do have laws. They do have clothing. They do have art. They do have worship. They have all these things, and therefore deserve respect because they, and here's the dangerous thing that's also got a punch, are just like us. Do you see the danger in that? Because what happens when later on they encounter indigenous communities that totally stretch the boundaries of the European experience, and then Europeans are faced with a complete other. Notice the pattern in both. Flip side of the same coin is to demean the other as somehow inferior, as somehow less than. Initially, the empire building around sword and, let's say, cross was about the Christians against the infidels, but slowly it became the superior Spaniards against the inferior, culturally, civically, all kinds of, you continue it, indigenous populations. This strikes me because in my own dealing with polarization today, I ask myself, where am I being stretched? And I fill in the blanks as a minister and as a child of God by the Holy Spirit. Where am I being stretched? Where I am in the face of someone who's so complete other to me that I'm also having to decide, well, how do I relate and what's the basis of my respecting or not respecting something that just is beyond my experience. I will tell you that there was a third response, but because this isn't a history class, I will just reference Francisco de Vitoria, who talked about the fact that, well, actually, maybe they're not natural slaves, but they're natural children. And we need the Pope and the King of Spain to somehow adjudicate among the different populations and raise the children to be happy together. Was that a happy solution as much as it was sought by the pragmatists in the church? No, because obviously the Pope and the King also represented different interests. Conoco. So when I arrived that same day that my grandmother told me the story about this statue I'd seen so many times on the seashore, my father picked me up in New Orleans. How many of you know Conoco? Yes! Okay, we got some Southerners here. Because I asked Rizal earlier, I said, no. What is Conoco, Brother Bill?
Colorado, Nebraska Oil Company.
That's right. Wow, you even know what it stands for. Oh my God, how do you know that?
I have relatives in oil.
So in New Orleans, I saw this sign as my dad was driving, and it was the very first thing I saw in the U.S. And I said, Papi, Conoco. Which in my Spanish is a way of saying, I know what that is. Conoco. My dad quickly, boy, where did you learn that kind of Spanish? It's conozco. And besides, this is America and you don't speak Spanish. You need to learn how to say it in English. Conoco. Split second. But it was enough for me to start to internalize this whole notion of don't speak Spanish, forget about your roots, and be really, really careful and maybe even suspicious of my own voice, my own language, and the things that I thought I knew. I give you that as a frame because so much of what has drawn me to Fe y Vida is helping young people break that notion of inferiority, accept otherness in whatever form it comes, both internalized and also to what we do to others. But most importantly, diversify the many ways in which we get to know our world. So, I'm going to show you some images from engaging stories. Some of them in the very chair in the room that you're in right now. And I just want to register what kind of impressions, what kind of assumptions, what kind of things either get triggered or just come to mind in a very free-flowing stream of consciousness way. And afterwards, we'll talk about There are quotes here. Rizal had asked the participants, who are juniors and seniors in high school, all identifying as Latino or Latina, to talk about how was the day, how was the experience. And these were quotes from their evaluations. Recognize the room? It's a good new experience with all these different, beautiful, and lovable people who give and deserve love. Good. Felt nice. Good weather. Met cool people. Yeah, that's the rhythm too. Lots of icebreakers, lots of team builders. With hearing my peers' experiences and stories with their faith, it made me feel stronger with the bonds of my faith and my new friends. That's the chapel next door. We asked everyone to write an appreciation note for everyone else in the community. We had about 30 young participants and then about a staff of about 8. And so we put out a bag along the wall there in the chapel, and people throughout the week could put in appreciation notes. Some of them asked, what did they ask? About what they should write.
They're like, what do I write? And so some of them chose to put in some Bible passages in there.
And this was one of the Bible passages somebody put on their evaluation. You may not understand the setting here, but this is a trust fall where elevated higher up someone's about to trust that their companions are going to catch them. This week has made me think. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. One of the activities is that they got to individually make a personal altar. How many of you grew up with an altar by the bed or on the table stand or in your home? I did, and some of you did as well. This is something they make, customize, and get to take home. I'm proud of myself for saying yes to this opportunity, not giving up, and opening myself up. Moment of reflection. By the way, because I believe in giving credit where credit's due, there is no crediting of the photos because I'm the photographer. And I always try to catch people without their knowing that I'm taking their picture. So. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. And do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make straight your paths. Taking advantage of the outdoors? Yes. I learned a lot about myself this week, and I feel like I can apply it daily because it's given me a different way to view my life. One of the things we did is peace circles. Dr. Burke, Dr. Phillips, and others are involved in that as a methodology here on campus. And thanks to Cristal, we were able to integrate it as one of the activities. And along the way, somebody said, have they gelled yet? And the answer? That's an understatement. And then you see in the middle Dr. Joanne Kuttner. She is our fearless leader directing this program with staff, including us. You see some of the student leaders who are students here at Lewis and some of the teenage participants there. On our way to lunch, by the way. I remember that day. I had to get out of the way. And then one of the things they did at the end is presented parable skits, parables of Jesus, but in the setting of their current lives today. And what I'd like to offer you as a frame from the work of Fe y Vida is that how many of you, when you thought Latino teenager, you thought of one thing that applies to all Latino teens? How many of you thought when you've met one Latino teen, you've only met one Latino teen? Okay? And then there are some of you who are in between, is what I'm figuring from some of the hands. One of the seminal contributions of Fe y Vida is that we dug into the literature, both sociological, educational, housing, employment, applications for college, how many are finishing high school. This was in 2007. It'd be interesting to see how we make this picture even more complex, especially in terms of layering in or the intersection of generations, right? Millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha. But we notice that there are 4 groupings, at least, that have to do a lot with identity, belonging, and purpose. I'm also aware that I'm using the word belonging with the resonance of that lecture by Dr. Josh Packard of Springtide here on campus last fall. And that is that immigrant youth get together and have certain dynamics which are distinct from identity seekers. Identity seekers are those who maybe find themselves, I am neither from the Dominican Republic, but I'm also not completely from New Orleans. And I'm in search so much of my life for who am I, in order for me to have frames from which to decide what community do I want to belong to? What do I want as a career, as a future? Mainstream movers. And lastly, high-risk youth. Youth who are in high-risk settings. Now notice, it's nice and neat. Everyone has their own little box. They don't touch. I appreciated the comment from Crisan that, well, what about if Gen Z in particular mixes some of this? Could there be other boxes, other overlaps, right? Even Venn diagrams where all of a sudden there are even mixed identities, intersectional identities. Where's LGBTQ as a layer on this, and how does that influence in the different settings, right? Now we can tell you at Fe y Vida which one of these groups you think increasingly is the majority of the youth that come to us to work with us at Fe y Vida. Which do you think is the fastest growing population in the U.S. among Latino youth? Identity seekers. Because? Okay. What made you think it's identity seekers that's the fastest? Because you're right.
Yeah, I would think that I've been in education for 26 years, working with adolescents and teens, you know what I mean? And the one that about going to college, the doors and opportunities of college and educational experiences has become more readily available, or opportunities that people are seeking out due to non-for-profits or people like your organization, just getting that understanding out there so that probably education-wise.
Yeah, and thank you for that perspective because it resonates so much with other areas where we're seeing, first of all, in our society, you have, at least compared to when I was 18 and leaving home, leaving New Orleans to go to college, there are a lot more options out there that are talked about in terms of identity. And when I have more choices, for some people that's actually more paralyzing, right? Some people in the midst of so many choices, you start thinking, well, oh, I thought it was just man or woman. Now I have other choices. And so it complicates things. The other thing is that within families, you've got that acculturation rift, which isn't always a smooth one. Maybe my parents wanted me to assimilate, and then all of a sudden I'm discovering my pride as a son of Montesinos, that statue, and I want to question Yankee imperialism, right? I want to question how sometimes maybe I've internalized certain things that project a sense of inferiority or superiority, and I want to question that. So even within families, sometimes that acculturation, how do I relate to the dominant culture? How do I separate towards my more nativist culture? So just to complicate this even more. But I point this out because when you saw those images, what was the point of diversity that your eyes picked up in those images? And had you ever thought, for those of you who hadn't thought about diversity, that even among all 30 of those participants, each one of these groups is represented? Did you know that? As a way of encouraging us, dig beneath the surface, right? Dig beneath the surface. And when we talk about bridge building, I'll end on this point. I am very grateful to William Bridges, who wrote the book Managing Transitions. And he has a model where he talks about most organizations start with beginnings. Okay, we have a new executive director, we have a new policy, we have new pay raises. That's on the dream list. Anyway, the point is, there are 2 steps before that. When you start something new, you have to let go of something old. And when you let go of something old, to think about it in terms of therapeutic models, there's a grieving process, there's a loss process. And then before you fully accept the beginnings, there's this in-between wilderness, as Bridges describes it, where you're quite not making sure, can I trust it? Is it really good for me? What am I really going to lose? Do I still have a role in the new organization? That sort of thing. The reason I mention that is because when we talk about bridge building, it's not just about seeing the new things, but here, this is where I want to engage you directly. What do you see differently now as we're having this conversation, as you continue to interact with your students, with your colleagues, with your own family members when it comes to Latino teens? What is your own bridge building impulse to cross the chasm and the divide, where all of a sudden you see a depth and a diversity that maybe you didn't see before? And what do you have to let go of to move beyond stereotypes either about yourself or about others? Having said that, I'm going to pass this to my colleague.
I'm going to be using the mic because I have lost my voice, so bear with me if you hear some cracks in my voice a little bit. But in this part of the presentation, I want to shift us a little bit into thinking about some theological concepts to help us understand bridge building people. And in particular, through the lens of accompaniment. There's a temptation when we think about bridging experiences or people who bridge to use them as kind of these people that go between these 2 sides, right? But I don't know if you all remember as a child when your siblings were fighting and that you were the one neutral sibling in the situation, and you're kind of going between both parties trying to be a neutral force and get them to communicate. But everyone can hear each other, right? It's a passive-aggressive way of addressing one another. And really in this way of being bridge, everyone is really harmed in that situation. So really a frame that I would love to propose in terms of how Latinos and Latinas can be bridging people is through the lens of accompaniment, as a fruit of gente puente in the church today. So, but before I move on, I just kind of want to take a quick poll in the room as how many of you are familiar with the term accompaniment or acompañamiento and how we refer to it in terms of the church's ministry? Okay, so our administrators. That's great, that's important because they need to know that. They need to know that. But for all of you, as we kind of move through this section, I want you to reflect on the question, in the midst of polarization and division, how might we look to the church to be a bridge builder? And so when we're talking about accompaniment, this is the buzzword that you walk into any ministry setting, any conference, higher education, anything related to some type of pastoral ministry, you're going to hear it. But a lot of people are walking around with different definitions of what accompaniment means. And especially when we're talking about terms and of the theme of polarization and division, it's really important for us to be on the same page page with what we're talking about, which again then helps us to bridge those experiences with those miscommunications. One of the working definitions that I would love to focus on comes directly from Pope Francis's Evangelization, if I'm able to, there we go. So he tells us the church will have to initiate everyone, priests, religious, and laity, into this art of accompaniment, which teaches us to remove our sandals before the sacred ground of the other. So a couple of things to pay attention to in this definition. This definition really gets us at the spirituality of accompaniment. It tells us that everyone is involved in the work of accompaniment. It's not just for priests, it's not just for religious, it's for the laity as well, which is everyone of the people of God. And the other is this idea that in accompaniment, you enter into this relationship where you can acknowledge the sacredness of the other. And especially when we're talking about polarization and division in a world today in our society, this is more important now than ever. The second definition that goes a little bit more into the practical aspects of what does accompaniment entail comes from the final document on the Synod of Bishops on Young People, Faith, and Vocational Discernment. So the bishops tell us through the consultation process of Synod, where they engage all levels of the church, the bishops share with us, spiritual accompaniment is intended to help people integrate step by step the various dimensions of their lives so as to follow the Lord Jesus in this process. In this process, three elements can be identified: listening of life, encounter with Jesus, and mysterious dialogue between God's freedom and that of the individual. So again, three things to pay attention to. Accompaniment requires us to listen to the things that are happening in people's lives, share life with them. For us to be true bridge-building people, we have to be living life with people. We have to know what hurts and what gives us joy and what brings us love. That is how we get to that encounter of the sacredness ground of the other. Yes, so the other is leading people to encounter with Jesus, so creating those spaces where people can come to know the healing and sanctifying love of Jesus Christ. And then the last is this mysterious dialogue between God's freedom and that of the individual. So we have to have an integration of life and faith that is happening in this process of accompaniment. So why are we talking about accompaniment as it relates to the Latino-Latina experience? So a lot of people know the word accompaniment, but don't know the roots of where it comes from. So we're going to dig into that a little bit. So accompaniment actually has Latin American roots. So accompaniment first makes its appearance in the final document of the Fifth CELAM, or Consejo Episcopal Latinoamericano, or Episcopal Council of Latin American Bishops, in their General Conference. At the time, Pope Francis, who was then known as Cardinal George Bergoglio, participated in the Aparecida Conference and was chosen by his peers to lead the committee that drafted the concluding document for the conference. Important things to note when we look into, I refer the document to all of you. It's not just available in Spanish, it's also available in English and I think in Portuguese as well. The document actually doesn't go into definition of what accompaniment is, because when the bishops in Latin America are talking about acompañamiento, that's already a way that the church in Latin America is living their lives. So we actually don't get an explanation of acompañamiento until Pope Francis introduces it to the global church upon his papacy. And a key thing to keep in mind, it actually first makes an appearance in 2007 in Aparecida, Brazil. So that's just some context for where it's coming from. It's really important for us to dig into the Latin American roots of acompañamiento because it's really taken shape for what the church is globally now, and in particular here in the United States. So Aparecida has essentially become the blueprint for accompaniment, and in particular, how much it's taken root here in the U.S. church. So in Amoris Laetitia, which was one of Pope Francis's apostolic letters, he talks about the accompaniment in the family, which was a key theme in Aparecida. And then in Evangelii Gaudium, he talks to us about evangelization through accompaniment. In Christus Vivit, he's sharing with us accompaniment of young people. And then in Fratelli Tutti, he's sharing about the accompaniment on the margins. So who are those on the margins of our society that we need to go out to? And those are just the key themes that point out in accompaniment, but Aparecida makes an appearance in as Laudato Si and other documents that have really shaped and formed Francis's papacy. So, let me go back. So, when we're looking at bridge builders, Pope Francis is already one of these bridge builders that is helping to bridge the fruits and the gifts that have been provided through the Latin American church and sharing it with the global church. These documents have gone on to shape the ministry of the church here in the United States, from family life ministries to young adult ministries to social justice ministries. Acompañamiento is a part of the everyday life of pastoral ministers in the church today. We can't escape it. And so, how then is the Latino community more able to share their experiences of faith with the church as we enter into this stage of acompañamiento? The Latino community in the U.S. church will be bridge builders in helping guide the U.S. church in the art of accompaniment that is deeply rooted in the Latin American experience. And this is key because in times when we are so divided, we need people to be bridges and to be doing it in the lens of acompañamiento, to be living and sharing and dialoguing with the people that we're called to serve. So, acompañamiento or accompaniment, however, is not without its critics. It never is, right? Some might see accompaniment as changing or in opposition with the church. When we get into topics of sexuality or race, people might see it as, well, you're just throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But this is kind of where I want to turn our attention to. Accompaniment is really just a rediscovery of our identity of church. So we look at this quote from the Directory of Catechesis, which tells us, today a renewed awareness of the missionary identity requires a greater capacity for sharing, communication, and encounter, so as to journey together in the path of Christ in the docility to the Spirit. Our missionary identity has always been a part of who we have been as church. Acompañamiento and accompaniment is just another way that we can fully discover what this missionary identity is. And the Catechism of the Catholic Church reminds us that the church, however clasping sinners to her bosom, is at once holy and always in need of purification, follows constantly the path of penance and renewal. So accompaniment is not a new way of being church or in conflict with the identity of the church, but rather a rediscovery of the church that we've always been. And the polarization and the division that we see in our culture, political system, and even in the church herself is nothing new. Accompaniment is the path of penance and renewal that we are living through as church today, rooted in the Latino experience. And we're already living this out in our campus here today. We live this out through our Lasallian Value of Association, which I'm sure you all are familiar with, but I'm gonna restate it. So our value of association is a commitment to student learning, development, and success accomplished through collaboration, mutual respect, collegiality, and dedicated service in the spirit of our Catholic and Lasallian mission. So I think back to my time here as a Lewis University student, where I was able to come to the table and and share my own experiences and not be treated as an empty vessel that was just being poured into by my professors who had all of the knowledge and the answers. Rather, they invited me into a dialogue to listen to the things of my life, of my experience that brought to life what I was learning in the classroom. That's a key part of what we live in Accompaniment. And then the other is through our Engaging Stories Summer Theology program, which Juan already showed you some pictures of what that process was like. And we're going to dig into it a little bit more in the next section as I throw it back to Juan. But really, this program is our opportunity to model accompaniment and bridging experiences for juniors and seniors, this next generation of the bridge builders, and send them out into their parish, into their schools, into their world, to be able to invite others into this relationship of accompaniment.
Thank you, Krista. How many of you raise your hand? There is a connection between bridge building and our faith. A few hands, okay? I'm hoping that from the presentation that Cristal and I are making, we get to push the boundaries, that there is something within our Catholic tradition that maybe would serve as a resource to speak to the signs of our times, right? Just like previous generations have had to respond to the divisiveness, to the polarization, to the name calling. It's, as I said earlier, and I know that's heard you laugh, as old as dirt. And so what I'd like to do in this next section is to talk a little bit about what were some of the transition points, bridge building points where the jóvenes, the young people, accompanied each other in making a shift, either in their thinking, in their sense of self, or even in how they have acted then and then after the program. So looking at what we call collective impact during. So these are some of the, by design, some of the processes or dinámicas that we include in the Engaging Stories experience. The first one we call Rise Up, which, if you know your spirituals and other references, it has a little bit of an activist bent to it. But it's just simply asking, imagine if we were all the participants, and I'm going to make a statement, and those who wish to identify with that statement are asked to stand and then sit back down. So I ask questions as silly as how many of you thought really long and hard what pair of tennis shoes to bring here? How many of you made sure that you went out and got a new outfit? How many of you forgot your toothbrush? How many of you are thinking, I can do without a toothbrush for a week? Then we ask some other questions. How many of you identify as Latino or Latina? How many of you identify as something else as well? How many of you identify as part of the LGBTQAI+ community? How many of you have had someone die from COVID? How many of you, besides studying at school, also feel the obligation to work to support your family? You can tell the questions are getting a little more vulnerable, a little more, and you know what? People stood up. And remember that comment? Have they gelled yet? This was an exercise the very first day, and we felt, as facilitators, they dared to cross a chasm and expose a part of themselves to each other. And there was no commentary. But from my perspective, that had a lot to do with the accelerant, how fast all of a sudden they were willing to go deeper on other community builders, but more than community builders, walking with each other across differences that became more and more apparent in the group. So, Women's Caucus. The men, to this day, complain that we didn't have time to do it with them. But basically, we gathered the women in the front of the room. The men are standing in the back of the room. The men have to be quiet while the women get to process, here on flip chart paper, 4 questions. What are the names I like to be called as a Latina? What are the names I don't like to be called as a Latina? What's the hardest thing about being a Latina? And what's the best thing about being a Latina? And then have the women, after they've individually been able to come up and write whatever they want, have a kind of conversation about what surprises them, what upsets or excites them, and what does this make them want to do when they get back. We did quadrants, where we divvied things up according to race and gender. So, white men, men of color, white women, women of color, and asked each quadrant, what's a question you've always been dying to ask of the other 3 quadrants? And have that quadrant come into the middle, hear the 3 questions, and respond, again, with no commentary. Just respond to the question among themselves. Parables. I've already made reference to that. What's amazing to me, and I want to thank Dr. Karen Trimble-Allion for setting it up with the Black Box Theater. The theater people were amazing. They gave props and all kinds of material. And I felt like I was watching a soap opera. I didn't feel like I was reading scripture. And yet, there was revelation there. And I'll leave it there. Afterwards, we wrapped up on a Saturday morning. I got an invitation for Sunday night to show up at a campfire that some in the local area had organized in order to keep the accompaniment, the energy, the connection, the community, the drive, the passion going. I didn't get to go, but I hear quite a few showed up. To me, that's just amazing. We didn't script that, right? They took initiative. They took initiative. There were some who were sitting on the fence about finishing high school. And I promised them I would not mention their names. But I know one in particular went back and finished 2 years of high school on an online program in the month of July. That's how motivated and sense of strong purpose that person received from the experience here. Some even made the decision to apply for college, knowing that somehow the answer to how is yes. They don't know how they're going to afford it. They don't know how their family's going to be able to make it without their working. But that's an amazing chasm that was crossed. And then lastly, some decided to build a business. Some decided to be activists for fellow DACA students in their youth ministry group. One in particular shared they decided to at least, I don't know what the result was, to have a conversation of potentially coming out as part of the LGBTQ community to their mom. I share this with you to say, notice the power of what I call the Spirit stretching us. Stretching us. And it's not because we have a magic pill. It's because somehow we created a space inspired by the preferential option to work with young people. Thank you, Lasallian. And open a doorway to see what they would do. Walking with them, not doing it for them. And so at this point, I'm going to end by saying, thank you. This is a paraphrase of one of T.S. Eliot's poems. In the end is our beginning, which I think is actually so appropriate also for De La Salle. And this was a very impromptu picture. Again, we were heading to eat. What's the running thread here? Always good things happen when you're on our way to do something good. And I'm not going to make more commentary than that. I say go and surprise us with what kind of breach building you get to do at your own table, in your own families, and in your community and classrooms. Thank you.
I've been asked to sort of, in a way, continue this conversation, or rather, to actually allow you to accompany the two speakers, right? To somehow make this more than just them pouring information, as Cristal said, into your brains, but maybe to have you open up a little bit. We have a class of students who are going to be future educators, and so you can understand that image in particular. And then we have many educators here too, who've been doing it for how long? 26 years. So, you know, what I was thinking is just, I would say, first of all, it's been such a pleasure to meet Juan. And Cristal is a student in the class that Madeline's taking with me right now. She's shown in, and my God, just a quick applause right now for the two of them. They know. And what I'm hoping is that you can give us some feedback, accompany them, or give them some more information, both for the engaging stories, but for their continued pastoral ministry work. Maybe a comment, something that you heard. And, you know, I'll say, in my work, vulnerability, key word. How does vulnerability play a role in bridge building, right? Juan was very dramatically, I'm exaggerating here, stepping over the chest, right? You know, trying to encounter another. That was something moving to me. But to all of you, many of you are explicitly educators. Some are going to be future educators. Some of you are students. Where are the divisions today? Where are the points where bridges need to be built? As you go into the classroom, those of you who are in the classroom, some things were mentioned, some things might not have been mentioned. And the third thing I would say is, as students, as educators, as future educators, did you learn anything today? Resources for what you might use in the classroom, even current educators yourself. So I'm going to open the floor and see if there's any comments. You know, usually we start off by saying, wow, that's really wonderful. So somebody should say that. Aside from me. Any comments? Or, yes, Jennifer?
That was just a wonderful presentation. Thank you for having it. But I guess in the opening, when we talked about how we're being, like there are topics that are somewhat polarizing, how did they address, are we asking the panel or are we, like, how does this work?
You know, you can, not me, ask the panel, and you might have to turn that on.
Just like you talked about how there are topics that are difficult to address in the classroom, and more now than ever before. What were some of the techniques or styles that you used to kind of tap into that? Because we always talk about relationship building first, but this was, I'm assuming, like a quick week long, you know what I mean? Like you dove in big, like right away. So if you can unpack that a little bit, that would be great.
Is this volume good, John, for the people at home?
Mm-hmm.
Good.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, at least in my own pastoral ministry, relationship building, as you said, is always key. I think in the classroom, it can be a challenge, I think, in terms of you see them maybe, depending on how your classroom is structured, you see them like an hour and you have content that you have to cover, you know. I think one of the key ways, because I've gotten a chance to work a little bit more with like the Catholic schools and high school settings, but I think in particular a method would be making use of office hours, but more so inviting people into an opportunity, not just discussing grades. Let's take the opportunity to just come to my office. I want to know you one-on-one. I think that especially if some of you are familiar with spring-type research work that they're doing, so much of the data is showing us that young people have about one meaningful conversation or interaction with an adult, influential adult in their lives, maybe once a day at most. So taking opportunity to invite them into a space, not just for academic purposes, but like, let's build a one-on-one, let's build a rapport. This is a space for you to integrate what you're learning in the classroom, for me to know about your life, for you to see that I care, so entering into that dialogue, that listening, that exchange. Because I think in the classroom, it will be challenging because you don't really know what the lay of the land is, right, of how you're going to address it. But if you're having those one-on-one conversations with that student and you're building that relationship, I think it opens up the entire have your space to then feel a little bit more comfortable of like, and I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name, but Jennifer is inviting us into a space, like I trust her and I know she's not going to put me into a situation that's going to be detrimental or harmful to me, so I'm willing to go there. So that would be one method I think I would recommend.
Why don't we stand up?
Sure. Thanks. I don't want to repeat what you said, so my thinking is aligned with many of those points. One thing that stands out, Maxwell talks about leaders are self-aware. And guess what? Before the participants arrived, we gathered as a team over in Darcy, and we had some difficult conversations. Part of it, the small group leaders were all white, non-Latinos. And so one of the things we talked about is what's the dynamic we're going to be setting up here? Is it one of those, great white hope where it only reinforces? And one thing I want to say explicitly is that we each got real with each other about what are our points, both of conviction, where I'm coming from as I do this work, especially because the young people are listening, smelling for authentic witness. Are you just full of baloney? Are you just telling me what's socially desirable or what my parents want you to say? Or do you really have convictions about what you're communicating? And by the way, we call it passion drama. I think that was also part. It's like we wanted to each one of us, rather than play a role, show up as we naturally are. You'll notice a difference in style between Pisa and myself. There's a difference in style between the other leaders that were there. And we really wanted to encourage one another. You don't have to be Latino, whatever that mask looks like. You don't have to do it this way, that way. Be yourself. And so part of me is a little conflicted about the fact that many times in our classrooms you just have one teacher. But then a question I have is, how do we support the staff, the education, the faculty, in a way to build that sense of self-awareness and to be much more intentional, even on the syllabus, to create this climate of be yourself. And no question is a bad question. And we really worked it the day before. And I say we really worked it because you can imagine, we had to set up tables, we had to set up chairs, we had to make sure everything was there for the little altar, blah, 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 blah. But I was inspired by the team because as soon as we started asking these tough questions, it's like everything else just, we forgot about everything because we knew how important this was. And maybe it was the elephant in the room. The other thing is building techniques for real quick. How do you connect with someone if you only have 30 seconds with them? How do you give them your undivided, delighted attention? I've got a good friend of mine who once met Thomas Merton at Gethsemane, and he talked about Merton's ability to be able to just look at you and you thought you were like the center of his world. How do we practice that with our students, considering how busy our lives are and how the flicker of moment of time? And the other thing I would say is stories. It's called engaging stories. So we gave them multiple ways in which they could start to tell their story. Even the rise up, that was a way to start. And we didn't come back and say, ooh, I noticed you stood up, and you want to say more about that? We gave invitation. This is so Lasallian. We invite people. We give them the open door. And if they decide to walk through, great. If not, also great.
Thank you. Another theme that they've mentioned often, voice and listening. Those are very important things for me as a teacher. I'm sure some of my colleagues here would agree with that same thought. Other comments? Yes. I'm speaking to that. You don't have to stand.
I don't have a question, but I have a comment I just wanted to share. Well, I'm Dr. Matt and an educator, and I really appreciate the image or the symbol of the bridge. A lot of times when we talk about this work, we think or talk about borders. I think of Victoria Anzaldua's work, and I love her work. I remember in grad school when I first started researching her, I was thinking, oh my goodness, I read a journal article or a book and it had Spanish. And I thought, wow, I've never seen it before. But with this And we have to admit, right, at the borders, there's a lot of conflict there, or there can be conflict at those borders. But I really like the image of the bridge, right? We don't know how long that bridge is, or how long you have to be on that bridge, or maybe you have to go away on the bridge for a little bit. And so I just really appreciate that, and I think this conversation has really helped me sort of reflect on where I'm at, and I would love to have these kinds of conversations as a teenager too. So thank you for your work.
Any responses? Where are you teaching?
I teach here
Okay.
in the English department.
Okay, very good.
Sorry, Ms. Green.
Yes. Jasmine's a coordinator of the writing center. Fantastic job, I think. I have two questions, and they're both related to art. The first one is, Christelle, you mentioned the art of accompaniment. So it's not just accompaniment, but there's an art. So if you could say a little bit more about that piece. And then the other kind of art is that there's a kind of signature art piece that we've used in publicity for the Signum Fidei Lecture. Maybe you could say a little bit about where that comes from.
Because I feel like yeah, so Pope Francis, I think, is very intentional with that word, art of accompaniment, because there's an activity that is happening, I think, with the art, right? In that dialogue that is happening between these two people engaging in a relationship of accompaniment, something is being created, something new is being created in that encounter, in that dialogue. Pope Francis uses, I think, that word, I think, to also generate in our own mind what new creation and new creativity is going to come from this relationship of accompaniment. So I think like that Pope Francis is very intentional in using those words and that framework, because I think something that even my own journey of faith and disaffiliation at one point in life, I thought about church and ministry and faith as something that was stagnant, like a rule book that was just placed there, that there was no imagination there. But rather, the art of accompaniment, what the church truly invites us is to a Catholic imagination, something that's new, that's being innovative and creating, that's bringing new life into the people that are engaging in that art of accompaniment. Because when two people come together in that moment of encounter, the Spirit is alive, and the Spirit does new things and creates new life. So I think that with that verbiage of the art of accompaniment, I think he's very clear and intentional with it. He's inviting us into a relationship of new life, of new creativity, a new way of being active, a new way of really not a new way, but a rediscovery of the church and our identity. And then, yeah, let me actually go back, because the artist of this image is actually a friend of mine, and come back here all the way to the thing.
It's on the thing on your seat too, right?
Oh, it's on the thing on your seat. Yeah, perfect. If you guys all want to take a look at that, that would be easier, so that I don't have to scroll through all of these. But that image actually comes from, and I'm just going to leave it alone. That image actually comes from an artist called Jacqueline Romo, and it's from her work, the Passion of la Monarca Migrante. So Jacqueline is, when she created this, it's actually part of the Stations of the Cross, and so this is the 8th station of the cross, where Jesus comes to encounter the women of Jerusalem, and they're actually weeping because Christ is on his way to be crucified, but Christ comforts them, encounters them. So this butterfly is actually Jesus. He is the butterfly monarca that is comforting, embracing them, coming together in this comfort, in this relationship of journeying, of accompaniment together. So Jacqueline is a DACA recipient and created this as part of her undergraduate project for, I think she was in digital artwork, and is now doing her MA in theology at CTU, Catholic Theological Union. So when I was thinking about this lecture, I was like, this is perfect. I'm actually using this image for another conference that I'm a part of. And I asked her, can we use it, because I think it's beautiful. And I think it's one of these new, again, this creative, this art that we get to come to in our own Latino experience and bring new life into these traditional views of faith that make it come alive in a new way. It's another gift, another bridging experience for something that we're so familiar with, the Stations of the Cross, that then comes to breathe new life in this experience of bridging our traditional roots into a new experience that maybe we're not as familiar with. So, yeah.
What a great question and what a fantastic answer. That's just amazing. Other comments or questions? Yes, Tyler. Can you speak loudly, or I can try to get this to you?
Yeah, so we have talked a lot about building a bridge here today, and I just wanted to mention, as a staff member here in ministry, I'm a hog here in Shield with athletics, but also with freshmen who have came to Lewis, who have tried to dig into faith and dig into their mission here at Lewis. But we started 2 weeks ago here in ministry. We started a group called Building a Bridge, which is for the LGBTQ community, but also those who are trying to build their bridge between coming from somewhere out of the country or even here who are trying to find themselves. So I just wanted to mention that's on Tuesdays here in ministry for educators who have students who are like, opening their doors but also don't know how to add to it. Ministry has that opportunity on Tuesdays at 4, where we're just trying to help those to find themselves, to build a bridge between them as a student here at Lewis, but also to identify themselves here at Lewis. And that's been something that in ministry we've been trying to do in the halls with freshmen, but also in the community is how do you identify yourself here at Lewis as a Lasallian, but also as just a believer in Christ. Where we have people who are all over the spectrum of believers. I'm a Lutheran myself, but going to a Catholic institution, we're trying to help people feel welcome, feel loved. And as educators, that's so important. I have not had a professor yet who has been like, I'm too busy to talk. And I think that's so important here at Lewis, which is why I chose Lewis. Educators' doors are always open. In the College of Business, which is where I'm majoring in, the doors are always open, which is so cool to see. And you walk through any of the building, it's so cool to see that the educators care. And they want to know where you're coming from as their student, but also as a believer.
Thanks so very much. Boy, I see him up here in 5 to 10 years. So we want to respect everybody's time. It's an important part of bridge building, identity. So we want to thank you all. Let's thank the speakers, the presenters.